It's pretty dark out tonight, so you may be wondering, what on earth am I doing skulking about in the bushes with my camera out? Well, in this video, what I'd like to do is share with you the magic of nighttime photography. I'm going to give you a 4-step process to make absolutely spectacular nighttime photographs, where we're going to make the invisible visible. Stay tuned. There, I think I'm just about set up and ready to go. Now, before I launch into this 4-step process, I just want to sing the praises of nighttime low-light photography. When I first started to learn how to use cameras technically and manually, I wanted to test their capabilities after dark because I wanted to create the magic of making the invisible visible, which these wonderful machines have a perfect power of doing. It may sound sad, but one of the first photographs I ever wanted to make when I had set up all the camera settings was a set of traffic lights with all 3 lights on at the same time. And this is proof that I managed to do it, and it remains to this day one of my favourite photographs that I've ever made, not because of its technical quality, because it's pretty overexposed, but just because I managed to do it. It was that feat of seeing something appear in front of my eyes that I couldn't actually physically see with my eyes. I needed a camera to be able to see it. Ever since that moment, I've been hooked on low light and nighttime photography, which is why I wanted to share this video with you this evening. You may not be watching it in the evening, but it's very much evening for me. Before I delve even deeper, I just want to outline the fact that when it comes to nighttime and low light photography, ideally we need to be doing everything manually. So if you've never done any manual photography before, then this may feel like a little bit of a step up. But believe you me, one of the best times to learn about photography and manual settings is after dark, because it forces you into doing it. And I think the results that you get are well worth the pain and effort it takes to actually set these things up and start taking photographs. So my recommendation for you would be to watch this video as many times as you would like to in order to be able to make everything sink in. And maybe even better, watch it whilst you are setting up your camera alongside watching the video. And do that in the light as well, because there's nothing worse than getting out in a dark landscape like this, not having a clue what you're doing, and only having a weak head torch for company. You don't want to be fondling around with buttons and faffing around with the camera when you can't see things properly, because it's only going to add to your frustrations, and you're going to think, well, why was Tom on about this nighttime photography being so spectacular? Because all I'm getting is more and more frustrated with the kit. Now, if you've made it this far in the video, then I'm presuming that you've got some kind of excitement and enthusiasm about taking your camera out after dark and making some amazing photographs. And if you need even more encouragement, then stick around until the end of this video, where I'll share my photographs from this evening, so you can see the magic that is possible with low light and especially nighttime landscape photography, which I'll be practicing a little bit later on. So let's launch into this 4-step process, and our first step is stability. Now, when it comes to low light and nighttime photography, we tend to be dealing with longer exposures. Now, you can increase your ISO which is the sensitivity of the camera's sensor to light, but that's only going to take you so far. It might be good for street scenes at night because you have ambient light surrounding you, but in a nighttime landscape situation like I'm in this evening, then a tripod is an absolute necessity. Now, I have to admit that usually I can't stand these things because I get my fingers trapped in them, they're cumbersome, and I can never be bothered taking them anywhere. So I only ever use them after dark. I know that a lot of people use them all the time, which is absolutely fine, that's up to you, but for me, I just think that they're a little bit restricting. But at night time, we do have to use them. The next part of stability may sound counterproductive, but it's all about switching off image stabilization. And you might think, well, Tom, I want a stable photograph. Why do I switch this off? But when you are working on a tripod, image stabilization works the other way. So you'll often find that if you've left it on, you get shaky, blurry looking photographs when you think, well, why is that blurry? Have I caught the leg of the tripod or something? No, it's because you've got your image stabilization still switched on. Now, with most cameras, that tends to be a flick of a switch on the lens, because most cameras have lenses with image stabilization built into them. If you've got a mirrorless camera like mine, the image stabilization is built into the body of the camera itself, so it's actually a selection of a menu item. So have your manual handy when you're doing this to see which is right for your camera. Once you've got your camera set up on a tripod and you've got that image stabilization turned off, it's time to move on to step number 2, which is focusing. Now, I have to admit, focusing after dark is probably one of the most difficult things you can ever do in photography, especially if you've got a mirrorless camera. Now, there are different ways in which you can do it, and I'll run through a few of them now. But first of all, we need to turn our camera to manually focus, especially if we're in a nighttime landscape. If you're walking down a street after dark and you've got lots of street lights and lights coming out of windows, then you should still be okay on autofocus. But when there's no light at all, apart from maybe pinpricks of stars or the moon or lights on the horizon as there are behind me tonight, then we need to go with manual focus. Again, to do that, it's a little bit like the image stabilization. It's more likely than not being a flick of a switch on your lens, but some camera systems make you do it in the menu, and some camera systems are really pernickety and make you do both. So a flick of the switch on the lens and also a menu setting as well. Now, this is where modern technology falls down slightly, because it tends to be older cameras and older lenses that tend to be better at focusing after dark. Older lenses will often have a stop on the focusing ring, so when you're turning it round, it won't continually spin round. It will stop when you reach the infinity point or the macro point of that lens. But in most cases these days, you've got a focusing ring that just keeps on turning. No matter which way you turn it, no matter which direction, you will not see anything happen, especially if you're using a mirrorless camera like I am. You won't see any focusing difference. A lot of mirrorless cameras will have a gauge at the bottom which has like a macro flower symbol at one end and the infinity symbol at the other end, which is like a sideways number 8, where you can see a gauge moving from one to the other to help you to set it up. But on some cameras and some lenses, if you focus to infinity, then it may be a little bit too far for where you're wanting to focus. So it can be really difficult. If you are using a DSLR, then set your focus during the day and don't touch the focusing ring because it will stick there. But on mirrorless cameras, you'll find that as soon as you switch the camera off, the focusing point that you've set disappears. So that's what makes it a little more difficult. What you can do is increase your ISO level so you can start to see stars and other lights on the horizon and focus those until they are pin sharp, and then turn the ISO down again to get a decent low noise exposure. Or you could position a torch or a head torch a little bit in the distance, focus on that until it's sharp, and then it should all fall into place once we get our camera settings set up, which is step number 3. A lot of cameras these days come with something called focus peaking, and that's where whatever is in focus within the frame of your photograph, either in the viewfinder if you're on a mirrorless camera or on the screen at the back of the camera, will glow in a certain colour. Some cameras you can set which colour you want, but most default to red. Now this can be really helpful after dark, especially if you've got stars in the sky or lights on the horizon. It just gives them a red glow when they are in focus, so it gives you more confidence in knowing that when you do make that photograph, then what you want in focus will hopefully be in focus. So we've got our cameras set up and steady, we've focused to the best of our ability. Don't worry if you have to take a few test shots, it's not out of the norm, even the professionals have to do it. We can now move on to step number 3 in our 4-step process, which is the exciting part really. It's where we get to set our exposure triangle settings. Now exposure triangle settings, if you've not come across them before, are aperture, shutter speed and ISO. For a brief overview of what they do, basically the aperture is the hole in your lens that lets the light in, so you can either open that up to let more light in or close it down to let less light in. The shutter speed does exactly what it says on the tin. It is how long your camera sensor is exposed to light for. And the ISO, as I mentioned slightly earlier on, is basically the sensitivity to light of your camera's sensor. But you've got to be careful with this, because if you increase it too high, then you start to get what we call digital noise, which used to be grain back in the good old days of film, where your photographs just look a bit pixelated and dotty, which when you're taking any kind of photograph, we don't really want to see. We want the best quality that we can possibly get. The setting that I like to choose first is my aperture, because that always acts as a base surrounding what it is that I'm photographing. You'll change your aperture setting depending on the subject matter that you're photographing. So for example, if you want pin-sharp stars in the sky, then you want your aperture to be as wide as possible. That means the smallest f number. Now on the lens that I've got on this camera, that is f3.5. I've got other lenses that will go down to f1.8. So anything that is as wide as your camera can possibly manage is the best for stars and starscapes, especially if you want to get them absolutely pin sharp as they appear in the sky to our physical eyes. If you want to slow the shutter speed down and create either star trails or expose a landscape after dark, then it may sound counterproductive because we are narrowing the aperture, which means that we're letting less light in. But what we're doing is we're allowing our camera to then expose for longer, so we get more light coming in and hitting the camera sensor. It's almost like it's building up layers of light. When we see with our eyes, we see in real time, so we're constantly taking in the same amount of light levels. But our cameras, they layer it up. So even when we've got a narrow aperture, by extending the length of time we expose for, the more sensitive our camera becomes to light over time. So for nighttime landscapes, it's pretty much the same as what you would set for a standard daytime landscape. Between f8, f11 would be absolutely perfect. And if you're wanting to create star trails, then you could go even narrower than that, because you want the longest exposure that you can possibly get. So push it up to f16, f22, something like that. So let's talk about shutter speed. As I mentioned earlier on, it's basically the amount of time you are allowing your camera's sensor to be exposed to light. Now again, like aperture setting, it depends on what you're photographing to what your ideal shutter speed will be. If you're photographing an astrophotography scene where you want those stars to be pin sharp in the sky, then an ideal range for your shutter speed is between 10 and 15 seconds. A slower exposure than that, you will start to see the stars streaking across the sky as we are set up stably on our tripod on a moving Earth. And anything faster than that, then you're going to underexpose your photograph, so it's going to come out looking quite dark. When we are photographing stars in the sky, we want as much detail as possible. So 10 to 15 seconds will be absolutely ideal for getting that detail into your photographs. For nighttime landscape shots, then we need to be exposing our sensor for a lot longer. Most cameras will allow you to go up to 30 seconds worth of exposure, which I know sounds like a long time, but if you're in a particularly dark area, then you may even need longer than that. So a lot of cameras, in fact most cameras, if not all cameras, come with what's known as a bulb mode. Now that allows you to press the shutter button down to open the shutter and then release it again to close it. Now that can be quite difficult to achieve if you're constantly holding the button on your camera, because as I'm already experiencing after only a few seconds, my fingers are getting rather cold, and also I'm introducing an element of camera shake because even though my tripod's sturdy, it's still moving around as I move around and talk to you. So for these situations you need a remote shutter release, which is either a cable that can be attached to the camera, an infrared fob which allows you to program remotely from the camera without any wires, or a lot of cameras these days come with apps where you can set settings in that app that will then be transferred via Bluetooth or Wi-Fi to your camera, so you don't actually have to physically touch the camera at all. That's really useful when you're using bulb mode because it just reduces the amount of movement that the camera's producing while you are exposing it for that longer period of time. Cameras like this one and a few others that you'll have to get and check your manual have what's known as a time mode, which is the one that I use personally more than bulb mode because it allows you to press the button once to open the shutter and close it with another press. So again, you're not pressing buttons on the camera all the time. You are being as remote as you possibly can be. For extra stability when you are doing exposures of between 10 and 30 seconds, it's a really good idea to set a self-timer on your camera because then it allows you to open the shutter button normally as you would do just pressing it, but it will delay the shutter from opening. That means, again, you can be nice and remote from the camera and not be worried about any shake and distortion getting into your photographs. One final point on shutter speed: if you are wanting to create those dramatic star trails where you're exposing the stars and letting them spin round on an axis around the North Star, then that is my first tip. Find the North Star and place that in the centre of your photograph. You can get great apps that tell you where things are in the night sky, and that will help the spiral of your stars to be in the centre of the photograph. And then my second tip on that is to use bulb mode and let it expose for as long as you possibly can do on the narrowest aperture you can set, because what that will allow you to do is to get a super long exposure. A lot of cameras will set on bulb mode up to 30 minutes before they cut out, which when you compare that to 30 seconds, it's a tremendously long time. Believe it or not, 30 minutes isn't often enough to get that effect that you often see on photographs online. To be able to get that effect, they've done something in post-production where they've layered multiple exposures. So if you want to try that, then try a series of 30-second exposures, stitch them together using your post-production software, and you'll have a fantastic rotating star spiral shot. Now we're finally moving on to ISO setting. Again, like aperture and shutter speed, it depends on what you're photographing to what your setting is going to be. If we're photographing stars, static in the sky and nice and sharp, then we're going to want to increase the ISO. Because, of course, if you remember back to what we said about aperture and shutter speed, we are not exposing for a long enough period of time for our camera to take in those layers of light. So by increasing the ISO, we're increasing the sensitivity, but again, we're introducing a bit of noise. But when you're photographing stars, then that's not always detrimental, because the noise will often add to the texture of the stars in the sky, especially if you're not going for an absolutely zoomed in pin-sharp detail shot. Now, different cameras deal with noise and ISO in different ways, and you'll just have to do a few test shots on your camera to see where yours sits. but a lot of cameras these days will allow you to go up to 6,400, maybe even 320,000 ISO before you start seeing noticeable noise. Noise tends to happen in darker areas of the photograph as well, which tends to be on a night sky, the darker areas in between the stars. So just watch out for those areas to gauge the amount of noise that your camera's producing, and tone it down or increase it even further if your camera will allow it. If you're photographing nighttime landscapes, well, we've got the stability of a tripod and we've got the ability to expose for longer periods of time, so we can bring our ISO setting right down. For these sorts of shots, again, it's like photographing a landscape during the day. I would expect a photograph to take in the lowest ISO setting you can do, which on a lot of cameras is around 100 ISO. So that setting will do perfectly well, and it will allow you to get minimal noise in your shots and get absolutely fantastic detail, even though we're photographing after dark. When we're talking about camera settings, we have to talk about one extra one, which I've sort of not mentioned so far because it's often a bit of an afterthought, but it's really important when it comes to nighttime photography, and that is our white balance setting. White balance, if you've not come across that before, is basically the colour temperature of our photograph. So at one end of the scale you get a warm orangey red look, and at the other end of the scale you get a deep sort of tungsten-y blue colour. Now, a lot of cameras these days have fantastic auto white balance settings, and even at night they can judge exactly what it needs to be set at. But if your camera isn't that great at doing that, and you're taking photographs after dark and you think, oh, these are coming out a bit orangey yellow because of surrounding street lights on the horizon, or it's really coming out quite blue because the camera hasn't got anything to judge the white balance setting on, then set a degrees Kelvin setting. Again, if you're not quite sure where to find that, have a look in your camera's manual, but it's within the white balance setting somewhere, of 3200, because that will neatly balance off the white balance at a neutral level to cut out any annoying street lighty coloured orange glow, or balance out any blue tones to the pictures that you make as well. So that was quite a mammoth section, wasn't it? So let's recap. Step number one was to get stable. So we've got our tripod and we've switched our image stabilization off. Step two was to focus. So we're focusing manually as close to infinity as we can get, using something that gives us a pinprick of light to be able to tell us where we are focusing and what's in focus within our frame, or using that focus peaking, which is going to glow red on whatever it is that we've got in focus within our frame. And now, hopefully, we've got our aperture, shutter speed and ISO, those exposure triangle settings, all ready to go, set up for a brilliant nighttime photograph. So we now need to move on to step number 4, which is another difficult one, I have to admit, and that is composing your photographs after dark. If you're in a setting like I am tonight, with just the handy torch for company, then as you can see, it's not lighting up very much behind me, so it's almost like guesswork when you're composing after dark. My advice is to do a test shot first. So increase your ISO as high as it will go, open your aperture as wide as it will go, and then take an exposure of about 10 to 15 seconds. This will give you a vague idea of what's in front of your camera. Then you'll be able to move the camera around a bit and make sure that whatever it is that you're photographing is the best composition to your ability after dark. When people see photographs that are taken after dark, they'll think, wow, that's a photograph taken at night. So they probably won't be as picky with your composition as it would be for a standard landscape shot during the day. But don't let that put you off from pursuing perfection, because a great exposed, perfectly composed nighttime photograph is much better than one where you've just pressed the button and hoped for the best. So that is my 4-step process to taking magical nighttime photographs, where we have the ability to make the invisible visible. Before I share my photographs with you, I just want to give you a few more general nighttime photography tips, ones that don't necessarily include setting up the camera. So my first one of these is to download an app that tells you what's in the sky. This is great if you're doing astrophotography or you want to create those star trails to find where the North Star is, to get it slap bang in the centre of your photograph, to get the nice symmetry around the star trails. This next tip may sound obvious, but it's amazing how many people just get lazy. The tip is to find places that are properly dark. During February, I team up with the Yorkshire Dales National Park with their Dark Skies Festival and stage photo walks in the heart of the Yorkshire Dales, where there's very minimal light pollution. It's great to get absolutely pristine photographs of stars across the sky without having that annoying orange glow that we talked about during the white balance section. Where I'm making this video this evening, I'm just up the road from the town, so I know that if I take photographs of the night sky, which there are a few stars out tonight actually, I may be able to get some, but it won't be as impressive unless you find one of those dark sky reserves, or at least somewhere where it's dark enough to not get that orange glow into your photographs. My next tip is to take your time. Nighttime photography is not meant to be a fast process, and it takes a lot of time, not just to make the photographs in the first place, but to get to a position where you are confident and comfortable setting up your camera after dark. So my advice is to not set a time limit on the amount of time that you're out and about, and immerse yourself in it. And you'll be amazed at how quickly the hours fly by, because you just get absolutely entrenched in what you're doing and the magic that it produces, that time just pales into insignificance, especially if you're out and about during the winter and you have some warm clothes on, because I must admit my gloves are in my pocket, so I could put those on if I want to, but I am starting to get rather chilly. So I suppose I ought to move on to my last tip and then start wrapping this video up. My last tip is another little technical one. Our cameras have something known as a histogram, which is a graph which shows you a tonal map of a photograph. You'll often see it if you press the up button on your menu to scroll through when you're looking at your photographs. It will come up with a wavy line graph, which if you've not come across it before, you might have thought, oh, what's that and how do I get it back to normal? But that graph at night time is very important to look at indeed, because it shows whether we've underexposed our photograph or overexposed it. But let's face it, it's after dark, so the chance of you overexposing it is pretty slim. But our camera screens, when we're looking at our photographs back on them, will often be a lot brighter at night than we perceive during the day. So we may look at the photograph on our camera screen and think, oh, that's absolutely fantastic, but get it back on our computer at home and think, oh, it's underexposed. So by looking at that histogram and making sure that all of those wavy lines are within the constraints of the middle of the histogram rather than pushed up at the left-hand edge, which they would be if the photograph was underexposed, is a surefire way of knowing that the photographs that you've got are going to be correctly exposed in the camera, and also when you look back at them afterwards as well. At this point, you're probably thinking, why on earth did I have this idea to get into nighttime or low light photography? Because it sounds like an absolute technological minefield. And yes, it can be complicated, especially if you haven't done anything like this before. But I can guarantee the more you practice, the more time you spend setting up, the more you'll reap the rewards and the more that you'll get absolutely hooked. For me, it's just that magic of making the invisible visible that just makes me keep going out and out and out again and again and again after dark. It is just a fantastic experience, and one that I think that every photographer should experience at least once in their lives. And if you have experienced it once, then believe you me, you'll want to experience it again. If you've enjoyed this video, then please hit that like button. It does a grand job in helping me to share this channel with other people that may be crazy enough to want to get out after dark and make photographs. Also, subscribe to the Yorkshire Photo Walks YouTube channel if you haven't done so already for more content like this. And if you'd like to join me on one of my dark skies photo walks, then check out YorkshirePhotoWalks.com and see the next one coming up on the schedule. You can also keep up to date with Yorkshire Photo Walks on social media, on Facebook and Instagram. We are at Photo Walks Yorks. I'll leave you with the photographs that I've made this evening on this beautifully dark night. I do hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you're going to get out there now and start practicing and start making the invisible visible with your camera. As I say, you will not regret it. Thank you very much for watching. I look forward to seeing you in another video very soon.
Baby, you can